Good evening, everyone. It's 6 o'clock. We'll just wait a few more minutes to make sure that everyone can connect. We're just waiting on one more committee member to be able to start. Okay, hi everyone. I believe that we are ready to get started. Just to make sure that the committee members in attendance form quorum, I'll just make sure that Allison, Shannon, that you're there. I don't know if you can give me a sign if you are. Maybe if you can just.
Madam Chair, before we begin.
Yes.
I would just like to mention to committee members, since we only have 4 members present, which is the least amount of members we can have in order to have quorum, that I just ask that they keep their video on and remain in the room for the duration of the meeting. Otherwise, we would lose quorum. For all those involved, including staff and members of the public, when you wish to participate at the appropriate time, please use the raise hand tool within Zoom. To do so, if you click on the participants button in the lower menu, which is on the left-hand side, that loads a menu on the right-hand portion of the screen. At the bottom of that area, there should be a button that says raise hand. So I'd ask that everyone, including staff, use the raise hand button as they wish to speak. And I will now let the chair commence the meeting. Thank you.
Okay, excellent. I'm glad to see everyone. Thank you for attending the meeting. So we are calling the meeting to order at 6:07 on November 2nd. It is a special meeting. So I would like to have someone to approve the agenda. So someone to move the agenda for today. Councillor Usharov, and someone to second that would be Charlie. Thank you. So all those in favor? Excellent. So we get to move on. There's no confirmation of minutes today because it is a special meeting, so none at this time. Are there any disclosure of pecuniary interest today? Seeing none, we can move forward. There are no delegations today. There are no briefings. But we do have 2 business items, starting with the Rural Kingston Economic Strategy presented by Craig Desjardins. So I will leave you the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair Conway, members of the committee. Always a pleasure to be before the Rural Advisory Committee, especially happy to be here tonight to present the draft Rural Economic Strategy. You may recall that the work undertaken is to advance Council's priority of examining the feasibility of establishing rural business parks, but also, and probably more importantly, it's to make sure that rural Kingston has a prominence within Kingston's new integrated economic development strategy. That strategy is currently in the final stages of development, and I think you'll be very pleased with what's been created. I'm going to keep my comments fairly short. Laura Blenis, the consultant from Stiletto, is going to run through the PowerPoint slides. I've asked her to keep it nice and short. There are a lot of slides, so hopefully you had a chance to have a look at it prior to the meeting. We wanted to give opportunity for committee members and members of the public in attendance to make some comments because we really value your feedback that we got at the last meeting. I'll just perhaps open up by saying a significant amount of work has been done, data gathering from a demographic, business count, an unbelievable amount of land use analysis, GIS data was examined, best practices from other municipalities in our community, but also further afield have been examined to look at what great ideas are happening in other jurisdictions. And we've certainly taken into account the impacts of the pandemic that's had on the business community across the world. And all of that data will be available in the final report. It's quite a sizable amount of information and will form a fairly large appendix with the analysis. I'll just close my comments and then hand it off to Laura by saying that, again, your comments about public engagement were well heard. I believe members, either Laura or Kathy Wood, who was on the call as well, had a chance to reach out to each of you on the Rural Advisory Committee. We were also, I think we've interviewed more than 30 participants from rural Kingston. The Integrated Economic Development Strategy did have specific rural questions. Of the 375 respondents, 78, or about 21%, were actually identified themselves as rural Kingstonians and completed the survey. And we have some data on that as well. So I think with that, I'm going to hand it over to Laura. And James, I think you're running, or somebody's running the slides, and I'll pass it over to Laura.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Craig, for the introduction, Madam Chair and members of the committee. It's a pleasure to be back here with you this evening. And as Craig has highlighted, what our objective is this evening is to take about 15 minutes and run you through the slide deck. We'll kind of pull key points that we think are of most interest to you, and then certainly be opportunities for questions when we conclude the presentation. If you have any questions on anything in particular, please feel free to bring them up at that time. So let's go to the first slide. So the few points on the first part of this that we won't get into the details on because Craig's already covered it. Really, the Rural Kingston Economic Strategy has been developed as part of the new Kingston Integrated Economic Development Plan, and certainly listed as a council strategic priority to develop a strong and resilient rural community, which is integral to the City of Kingston's economic health. Next slide, please. A total of 35 historical City of Kingston reports were reviewed. As Craig indicated, about significant data analysis was conducted, about 9,500 data points, including asset mapping, the consultations, surveying of the land and the options, which we'll show you as we talk about HAMLET-LED development and business park potential. We'll get into that as well in the discussion. Next slide, please. And we've already talked about this as well. Let's go to the next slide, please. Craig already mentioned this, but I will just underscore the fact the survey was open for about 3 weeks. We had 375 surveys that were completed, with 78 respondents self-identifying as rural residents, which is actually very consistent with the percentage allocation of the number of people that are living in rural Kingston who participated in the survey. The same percentage applies. Next slide, please. A couple of highlights from the slide, and this is in your deck. This is from the survey, and we thought it was important to note the 67% of the respondents listed broadband connectivity as their number one priority when they were asked, what do you think the city should focus on to facilitate economic development in rural areas? Number two was supporting existing businesses in rural areas with 41%. The third was developing new industries within rural Kingston at just about 40%. And then, of course, the remaining two, promoting new tourism in rural areas, and we'll talk a little bit about tourism, and encouraging existing businesses to relocate to rural Kingston. Next slide. When rural residents were asked which opportunities you would like to see implemented within rural Kingston, considering existing infrastructure constraints, the top 5 responses were agri-food production and/or packaging at 53%, small mixed-use retail and commercial centers at 50%, rural tourism opportunities at 49%, bed and breakfast at 38%, and business clusters that house similar companies for their office space at 37%, as well as cottage rentals also at 37%. And you'll see each of these weaved into the recommendations that we're going to share with you this evening. Next slide, please. So about the strategy, we've already mentioned this. So the goal of the strategy is to position the City of Kingston for long-term and short-term sustainable economic development growth. Next slide, please. All of these are weaved into the Kingston Integrated Strategy. A little bit about target outcomes. The goal really of developing the rural strategy, the Rural Kingston strategy, is again aligning with opportunities in the integrated economic plan, including industry growth in the identified core sectors, clustered development. We know that clustering has been identified as a topical area for many of you around the table, as well as with City Council. Having a cohesive rural development approach to align with the overall vision of the City of Kingston and Kingston economic development. Identification of short-term rural development opportunities that can drive both immediate results for overall economic development for the region, but also looking at number 5, identification of long-term rural development opportunities. And you'll see this in our strategy, both what we're going to discuss today, but also in the actual report. We have considered timelines for some of these initiatives because some of these things will be able to take place in the short term, and others will be more with a longer term lens, opportunity for longer term planning over the next 10 and 20 years. Identification of short and long-term rural development opportunities to support residents and residential growth in rural Kingston. We do think residential growth is going to be a critical component to any of the opportunities that have been identified. And the identification of short and long-term rural development opportunities to support business expansion and potential investment attraction to the City of Kingston. Next slide. Some metrics for success that we've identified, and this is also consistent in the Integrated Economic Development Plan. Of course, we want to support new businesses for startups, offer business expansion potential, looking at ways of attracting investment, expanding opportunities for R&D and innovation, supporting newcomers and immigrant entrepreneurs, strengthening community engagement, and leveraging and building infrastructure and assets. These are sort of core fundamental metrics that we will see over a period of time. Again, some of these things you're not going to see immediately or in the first 12 months, but the goal is that we develop metrics for measuring impact over the next 5 to 10 years. And that's when you'll really start to see some shifts. Next slide, please. A bit about rural Kingston. I know that we spoke about this a little bit in our last discussion, so we won't spend a great deal of time on this. Next slide. We want to spend the majority of our time talking a bit about the recommendations. So as we mentioned in the last session, the boundaries that you see here, there's really 2 completely rural census tracts, and that's the 113.02 and the 10100 in Codes Corner. There are some that are actually on the boundaries slightly that are considered rural urban census tracts within the rural area. The tract that we see the most significant amount of businesses is 02, so 11302 on the left-hand side is, and you'll see that in the upcoming slides. Next slide, please. Demographic highlights. The population in rural areas adjacent to the urban core has risen over a period of time, of course. Not uncommon. This is happening all over in many urban centers. And we talked about this a little bit in the last session as well. The age of the full rural parts of Kingston, those 2 northern tracts that I had shared with you that are fully rural, have a median age of 49.5 compared to 41.3 in the urban core. So the age is a little bit higher in the rural area. The income in rural Kingston has an overall higher income level than in urban Kingston. On average, housing prices, the value of dwellings is actually higher in rural Kingston than in urban Kingston. More than 94% of the 25 to 64 population in rural Kingston have at least a high school education. And there's a significant amount of self-employment in rural Kingston. This is mostly due to the large farming sector, and self-employment in rural Kingston is much higher as a result. Next slide, please. So why do we need a rural economic development plan? And let's go to the next slide. So we certainly want to have a coordinated plan. Obviously, there's an opportunity with the Integrated Economic Development Plan to identify rural Kingston as an asset, which is how it is featured in the integrated plan as an asset of the city of Kingston. So we want to capitalize on opportunities in rural Kingston that will be easier if there's a framework for population growth and development. So if there is a plan, then we can have intentional development, as we like to say. And the city can then guide the composition of residents in its rural areas so that you avoid sort of random pockets of development, and it's in a much more controlled and again, intentional way. The growing population of retirees and the attractiveness of rural living is leading to growth in rural areas. And this is happening all across Ontario, particularly those within urban regions. It's very common right now. So these are the top 3 reasons why we want to make sure that there's a plan. So we have that intentional development over a period of time, again, both in the short term and as we look ahead to the longer term. Next slide. So let's talk about the strategy framework, and we'll go right into the next slide. So in terms of the strategy components, and we're actually calling these pillars. So pillar 1 is the development opportunities. Pillar 2 is enablers. And so there's 2 pillars, components, as you see on this slide, 7 themes and 15 recommendations for rural Kingston as part of this strategy. And I'm going to walk you through these. So on the development, we have opportunities in agriculture and tourism, and then development opportunities in HAMLET-LED and rural cluster development, which we're going to talk a little bit about each of these 4. And then enablers are simply areas that we believe that could be enhanced to create greater ease of doing business in the community and for both businesses as well as within the city as a whole. So project selection and approval processes, review of funding envelopes that may be available to support some of the identified initiatives, and identifying alternative servicing options as well as we consider longer term infrastructure requirements that may be considered over a period of time. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk a little bit about all these. So under the five themes, as we call them. So theme 1 is agriculture. Theme 2 is Hamlet-led development. Theme 3 is tourism. Theme 4 is rural cluster development, and theme 5 is enablers. So under agriculture, we have 4 recommendations, which include attracting new farmers, encouraging local food consumption, fostering innovation in farming, and looking for niche and value-added food production opportunities. And I'm going to explain these in each a little bit more detail on the rationale, and then again, looking forward to certainly your feedback on this. Hamlet-led development. So the hamlets were identified in the official plan for the city, and so we've aligned the potential opportunities in the areas for development and clustering activities around where the hamlets were identified and where there are some pockets of population base in rural Kingston. And so for hamlet-led development opportunities, we would look for specifically triggering development based on hamlet development locations that have been identified, encouraging centralized residential development in those hamlet areas to increase the population base. Certainly some areas have a population over 1,000 people, but not all of them. And we do believe that you need a little bit more population in some of the areas to be able to justify any commercial development that could be on the table. Attracting commercial business activities to the hamlets to support the current firms is the third under hamlet development. Under tourism opportunities, there are 2. So looking at animating tourism opportunities and encouraging agritourism initiatives, which is becoming, it's very trendy right now, certainly a best practice in many markets that we've studied and looked at. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. The rural cluster development, there's several opportunities for rural cluster development, encouraging industry-focused business park development, leveraging opportunities that capitalize on access to Highway 401, and exploring the potential for a healthcare center, again, over a period of time as your residential base expands. There may be an opportunity for consideration of a healthcare center. And then, of course, enablers, which I've already mentioned, the process selection and approval process, reviewing potential available funding envelopes, and exploring alternative servicing options. So we're just going to talk a little bit more briefly about each of these, and then I'll share with you the implementation trigger points that we would propose, and then we'll conclude with that and open it up for conversation. So next slide, please. So the next slides kind of talk a little bit about, so on the left-hand side, you see the recommendation, and on the right-hand side is a bit of rationale. So it's just a couple of quick snippets and facts for you for easy reference. And again, you'll see this in more detail when the report is released. And has much more backup and information, as Craig had indicated. But certainly from a high level on the agricultural side, there is an existing sector base that can be expanded upon and supported. There's an estimated 148 farms within the city limits with a minimum of $30,000 in annual revenue. Not all of these farms have employees. There's actually 119 of them that do not. And so many of them would not show up. And when we look at the highest concentration of industry counts in the region, the local farms that do not have other employees other than the owner of the farm do not show up in that analysis. And so we do believe that there's an opportunity here. Further conversation would need to take place with some of the farmers that have these farms, but certainly there's certainly sufficient information to suggest that this is worth exploring. There's alignment with city priorities. So the City of Kingston Strategic Plan 2019 to 2022 has specifically focused on the importance of local agriculture and, of course, food security and COVID-19. The COVID-19 pandemic has put particular focus on the importance of local food supplies and resiliency. Also, tremendous opportunity for agriculture. Worth noting of the 14.5 million people that Kingston is in proximity to within a 3-hour radius. It's one of the key value propositions that you're going to see in the Integrated Economic Development Plan, which is a prime opportunity for transportation, logistics, and warehousing, which agriculture could also support as well. So that's certainly worth noting. Next slide, please. Hamlet-led development, as I mentioned, we have 3, and the rationale, certainly alignment with municipal and provincial planning documents. The 5 existing hamlets satisfy several requirements needed for rural development. There's actually 6 hamlets in the official plan, but we've identified 5 that would be most suitable to consider based on current concentration of population base that as a starting point. And then certainly the need for preservation of rural areas in a concentrated development, preserving larger rural areas. And so if you can have concentrated development, you can preserve larger rural areas if your focus and your development occurs in an intentional and clustered fashion. Next slide, please. In tourism, there's two opportunities. And then of course, the rationale being the attraction of tourists. So the city of Kingston is among the top cities for the attraction of tourists in Canada each year. In fact, Kingston has one of the highest tourism numbers in GDP of any CMA in Canada. So significant tire traffic, as we call it, that's coming into Kingston, and now even more so with COVID-19, with fewer people flying. There's a tremendous opportunity to boost tourism activities and leverage this market access. And strategic location, as I've just mentioned, the city of Kingston sits at the midpoint along the Montreal, Ottawa, Toronto corridor, where 14.5 people are within a 3-hour drive, which is a significant opportunity. Next slide, please. Rural cluster development, we've highlighted 3, and the rationale, of course, is alignment with city priorities. Again, the City of Kingston strategic plan calls for the exploration of a rural cluster, and then constraints within urban Kingston. So there is limited space in urban Kingston. There's several park developments that are in progress and that will take place over the next period of time. But upon the full maximization of those lands and occupancy of those lands, there will be a need to explore options outside of urban Kingston due to land availability. And so this positions rural Kingston as an ideal location for park development, again, over time, once certain trigger points are taken into account. Next slide, please. Enablers, which we've discussed. So the main rationale is for implementation. So this is to ensure that rural Kingston can realize opportunities. Residents within the planning guidelines and in funding must be reviewed. And so just having an opportunity to be able to consider what funding envelopes may be available to support some of the recommendations. We're aware that there are some programs both provincially and federally that could support some of these activities in a meaningful way. And so considering those, it's important to note that this cannot certainly be done by the municipality alone. There will need to be support that is considered and explored to be able to support these recommendations. And additionally, with the servicing options and the servicing requirements, there are legitimate infrastructure requirements that would need to be considered over a period of time. And certainly looking at what some of those options may be will be very important. And next slide, please. So that's a little bit about the recommendations. I just want to talk for a moment on the implementation, and then we'll move to the questions and discussion. Next slide. So in terms of pre-implementation requirements, we've put this together, and again, you'll see this in the report, but we've got 15 recommendations, 7 themes, and the 2 pillars. And it's important to note that there are a few things that will need to take place prior to the implementation of these recommendations. We need to confirm a champion and lead for the strategy, a governance and implementation body and resources. And by that, we mean human resources, financial resources, and budget allocations to be allocated to delivering the activities and the outcomes for this strategy. Again, this is a long-term strategy. This is not something that will be implemented in a 12-month period. It's over an extended period of time. And so consideration would need to be given to, prioritization of activities, looking at a detailed action implementation plan to confirm how to mobilize the growth in the identified sectors and the roles and responsibilities, some of the detailed timelines. There will need to be some additional community and stakeholder engagement. And by this, certainly we do believe that we should be meeting with farmers, which is item number 6, to discuss their requirements and need for support. This would include sort of additional market validation and again, continued conversation. We believe there's opportunities in everything that's presented. And as part of any process, it continues to be iterative as we look to implementation. Next slide, please. So once these 4 areas are confirmed, so confirming resources, confirming the implementation lead, looking at the action implementation plan, and completing a market validation exercise, then there's several categories of activities that can happen over the next 24 months. And I'm just going to highlight a few quickly. We'll just go to the next slide, please. So there's logistics and internal mechanics, there's partnership and collaboration, and community outreach and engagement. This is just intended to be a little bit of a roadmap for the team. We found other clients that we've worked with have really appreciated having a little bit of a checklist so that we can, move things forward. and that the team is equipped with what they need to sort of understand how to be able to make this a reality. Let's move to the next slide. So under the logistics and mechanics, it's about resources, working with city planning, looking at benchmarking, developing a land use plan and figuring out what that needs to look like. Next slide. I'm just going to run through these fairly quickly because, again, this is really just a checklist. Your partnerships and collaboration. So working with Kingston Economic Development, of course, with the work they've been doing on the integrated plan with the City of Kingston, a logical choice to be working closely with on understanding what the opportunities are. Working with Tourism Kingston, again, this is over the next couple of years. Engaging and supporting organizations to mobilize the plan, engaging neighboring municipalities, which we know is currently underway as well in terms of having conversations about what some opportunities may be for collaboration, which is very exciting. Next slide, please. Oh, next slide, please. Thank you so much. Community outreach and engagement. Oh, sorry. Almost. Community outreach and engagement. So just continuing that community engagement. Again, working with Kingston Economic Development to meet with the farmers, meeting with local developers to understand what their potential may be for residential or other cluster development over a period of time, and then strengthening the value proposition and case for investment. So that's a summary team for what we've been looking at, what we've been working on with the team at the city. Craig, and I know Brandon Forrest is also on the call, and certainly happy to answer any questions that you may have at this time on anything that we've put together and what we're proposing that's going to be included in this very exciting integrated plan for rural Kingston that will be in the integrated economic development plan. Back to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much for your presentation. So we'll start with questions from committee members, and then we will reach out to see if there's any members of the public that are attending the meeting and that have questions, and then we will have more comments and discussion at that point. So are there any questions for Ms. O'Blennis from the committee members? Okay, I do have a few. Oh, Councillor Usharoff, please be my guest.
Sorry, you can hear me there. Good. Madam Chair, I'm willing to wait a few minutes too. I don't really need to go right now, but if you could come to me before we leave the committee, I certainly want to give everyone a chance, and that's what you'll do. But you know, I have seen glimpses of this. Really, I think Laura has done a great job, and the team. Maybe before can we go back? Are you going to go back twice, Madam Chair? Can we go over the, because I do have a couple ways to wrap it up a little bit, and being the councillor for the rural area. I just wonder who exactly put this together, Laura? Who is all on this? I'm not even clear on who did all the work here.
So our consulting firm was engaged to conduct the work on this project, Councillor Oosterhoff. So we would have conducted all of the data analysis. We engaged, so you would have had a conversation with Kathy Wood. Kathy Wood was engaged through our firm because we know she's done a fair amount of work in rural Kingston and in Kingston. So we were delighted to have her as part of our team, but we led the initiative. So on our team, we would have had Kathy, our economist, participated as part of our strategy team. And then our business analysts and data analysts would have participated as well in the data collection and analysis and the formulation of the recommendations. And when I mentioned certainly Craig and Brandon, they would have been participating in various discussions and meetings with members of the team that Brandon oversees. And in terms of getting information, we also worked with the GIS team at the city to collect certain data points that we needed for the review of different land options around the hamlets and the potential rural parks. So we worked together with a number of members of the city of Kingston, but our firm was engaged to carry the brunt of the work.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Laura. That helps me again. I think we saw it, but I also want it for the community members who are here tonight and are listening, and I think it's going to be really great to hear from some of them as well. So for some of them, we'll hear it for the first time, and I think that I just want to commend you guys again. This is good. There's a lot that we can talk about here. So I'll come back to. I'd rather hear some other conversations first, Madam Chair, and then if we can come back to some of the questions I have. And I really am encouraged by this, but I do want to hear from our committee.
Excellent. I do have a question, Laura, and it's maybe based on my own ignorance of some terminology. I felt that the two pillars of the HAMLET-LED development and the rural cluster development to be very aligned and very similar, like one would not necessarily come without the other. Is there a specific reason why they're not forming one pillar, one consolidated pillar, and that they are standalone pillars?
Yeah, so great question. Thank you. I think the main reason is because we were inspired by the opportunity to look first and foremost at the hamlets that were identified in the official plan, which, as I mentioned, there's 6 of them. And so as we started to consider options for what that could look like, the starting point, it's almost like a sequencing. So in having the hamlets as a focus for development, both first as a residential, in terms of residential development and creating a bit of critical mass, and then from the hamlet development, you'd end up having the need for commercial services, or it's almost like the hamlet development is smaller scale commercial development, and your rural park would be perhaps a larger, concentrated. It could even include, industrial park. I don't want to say industrial park because that's actually not one of the things that we identified in it, but something more that is a larger park area taking up a larger space, whereas hamlet is more supporting the residential area. So they are sort of separate because the uses are very different. In a hamlet, what we're proposing in the hamlets would be a very different use because it's more support services like retail or commercial or gas stations and that kind of thing. That is sort of community-based businesses that support residents in that particular area. Whereas the parks that we looked at would also be, we would recommend being clustered around the hamlets because there's several options for lands that would have contiguous land of more than 100 acres close to the hamlets. So we've identified several of those within each of the hamlets that you could develop out, but they would have a much larger critical mass. It would be more focused. So for example, one of the main industries in rural Kingston would be in construction, which may come as a surprise to some, but construction ranks up in the top, actually as the top sector. And so there may be an opportunity for construction, or for, as I mentioned, transportation and logistics could be very interesting. There's cluster development that we're looking at in the integrated plan around manufacturing and health innovation over a period of time. There could be a focus on certain sector, larger based. And so it's partly size and it's partly sequencing, I would say, would be the reason that they are separated, if that makes sense.
And Madam Chair, if I can just add to Laura's comment, I think one example, interesting example that we've seen on the HAMLET-LED development is an example of sort of rural co-working spaces. So if you think of sort of almost incubation spaces, co-working spaces, with the large number of sort of consultants, scientific and sort of technical experts that live in rural Kingston, having a co-working space where you could sort of meet with clients not in your home, and work in a space, have high-speed internet, close to coffee, and again, that would be another example of sort of a cluster development in the hamlets.
Thank you. That was very helpful for me to have a clear mind on how they're different. That was really helpful. Are there any other questions from members of the committee? Yes, Charlie, please. You're still on mute.
There we go. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Let Allison go first because I think she's far better spoken than I am. But I will say this: the agricultural side of it, I'm very confused on, because I know if I go to my neighbors and start talking about this, they're just going to look down at the ground and say, we don't even have roads to drive on. We're in our part of the township or the city, and yet we're talking about all this wonderful attracting more farmers and businesses and whatnot. I don't think you can do that without a reasonably good road to drive down. that's just a small point, but I'll leave it there and I'll let Allison talk, and then maybe I'll come back later.
Thank you, Charlie. I think the infrastructure development is an interesting component of economic development, for sure. That should be at the forefront of our minds. Allison.
Thanks, Madam Chair. My question is, when Mr. Desjardins introduced the topic, he was talking about this is the draft rural economic strategy to really see about the feasibility of rural business parks, which seems to be the goal. Yet the surveys and the information that the consulting group has brought forth doesn't really talk about that. So I'm a little bit confused about the connection. It seems that there's a lot of importance, and rightly so, placed on agriculture and the opportunities, but where does that fit with the feasibility of rural business parks? Because you have to look at land use within that and competing land use. And are we setting ourselves up for having competing land use, and you want to attract more farmers, but are they going to be competing for land with commercial developers? I just don't see, there seems to be a fairly strong, lofty goal, but I don't see it explained within this report where that fits in. There's lots of talk about agriculture, tourism, and so on and so forth. So a little bit of clarification would be helpful. Thank you.
Craig, I will let you answer to that, or Laura, if you have an answer.
I was going to say, Craig, if you wanted to go ahead and I can add, or if you'd like me to, I can.
Why don't you kick us off?
Sure. So thank you for the question. Certainly. So the review of looking at the feasibility for rural business park and cluster development was certainly a component of what we were asked to consider and look at in this exercise. But that was really only one component. And certainly on the agriculture, it's not actually to presume that is the overarching piece that's the one end all and be all component. It needs to be highlighted because of the number of farms that you do have and the type of land that you do have. And while it's important to consider and look at use of potential clustering for business parks, we also have to be realistic in that we have developed this as part of an integrated plan with the City of Kingston and Kingston Economic Development. And there are other business parks that are currently under development within the City of Kingston. And it would be unrealistic to anticipate or presume that there can be other initiatives starting when that land has not yet been fully utilized. And so it is a timing thing. And so, yes, it's certainly been considered. It should be considered. It should be considered, we believe, over a longer period of time, simply because there needs to be a sequencing of some population growth and density, the servicing with the hamlets for those opportunities to service those residents. And then over time, as land is fully utilized within urban Kingston, then there can be an opportunity to develop those further. And so certainly considered, certainly part of it, but also having to be realistic in terms of the sequencing and what the other opportunities are in other parts of the city as well. Craig, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Yeah, thank you. And I would augment. I think it was a good answer. I would say that the intention here of looking at rural business parks was the council priority. I think in order to do that, though, you have to look at the data. So you couldn't just look at business parks without looking at anything else. So when we sort of saw the door open for exploring rural economic development more broadly, and again, it was, I think, a very good opportunity, something that has been I know a priority of Councillor Oosterhoff and Councillor Boehm to make sure that rural has a place at the table. I think as the data came back, we saw, and as Laura sort of alluded to, some of the rural areas that are more adjacent to urban are not very urban anymore, or less urban than they used to be, and that's just the reality. I think I think anecdotally you've known that construction was the number one sector, but I was certainly surprised at the very significant size of it. Certainly also surprised at the scientific and other services as well. So as the data sort of presents itself, we sort of started to look at other aspects of rural economic development. So the door was open when council set the priority of rural business parks, and we've just opened the door a little wider to look at opportunities in rural Kingston.
Councillor Oosterhoff.
Sorry. Thank you for both those answers, Laura and Craig. And I do want to speak to it as well, because some of that, of course, as being the only council member here, I was at the strategic planning, 2 years ago already. So, and it was part of 2 platforms. So this is not just from me, but this is kind of a look at it. And what I really want to make sure we picture here is that anything that is going to be done would not be a threat to agricultural. And one of the things I thought a lot about, Laura and Craig, as we try to understand this, and with economic development as well, I see that Donna Gillespie is part of this. And the Kingston is a very unique city, and it's so important to see that every area that we have, like we have the downtown core and its uniqueness, we have the east side and it's the bridge going there and its uniqueness, we have the west side, the economic engine of Gardner's Road, and we have the beautiful residential areas and industrial areas. So what we're really trying to, I believe, paint a canvas is what does the rural area look like and how we can do it really well. None of the developments that we want to do or not want to do or could do in all the areas that we think about are a threat to the other areas of the city. It's going to be a symbiotic, the picture is a symbiotic development where the synergies all work together. And one of the things that concerns me is that sometimes we different areas of Kingston will worry about, industries leaving or the strength of the downtown or whatever. And that's not good land use planning. It's something that is supportive of the whole. And I'm a rural person. I want to protect our rural way of life. And I think it's really something that will be embedded and recognize our values, our way of life. But there is so much potential within that, abandoned lands and opportunities for business. When you see the data, you will recognize the potential that is there, and especially driven now with the pandemic and that. So I hope that the picture, it need not be one of protectionism, but of opportunities. And in that, I wanted to ask Laura, one of the things we hear a lot about that really restricts people that I've gone through as a business that we see is land use planning. And Laura, how do we address that with the city, and how much has planning been part of this? I spoke to a developer just the last 3 weeks in a row. They're calling, and they would like to talk to Kingston, but it's the zoning that is so restrictive. And is that a reason why people would hesitate, or what will that be a time of engagement with planning as well?
Yeah, so thank you for the question, Councillor. And so a couple of the reasons why we put together the pre-implementation requirements is because, again, approaching this realistically and tactically, the next steps are some of those types of conversations. We certainly have had conversations with Paige in the planning department. I believe she's the commissioner is her official title. I apologize if I'm not saying that correctly. And she's been wonderful to work with in her office, very supportive of a number of the ideas that we've been putting forward. And certainly that would be part of the next steps is to understand what this means to planning, and looking at this from a lens, not just the first step is to look at all of these opportunities purely, as Craig had mentioned, based on data and based on from an economic development perspective. Because if we look at it and get things clouded with planning and zoning and all those things, even though that's very important, if we really want to be thinking through what the real opportunities are, we have to first look at it from an economic development lens, which is what we've done in this exercise. And so what would need to occur in the next step is taking it to the next level, which is, okay, now what does this mean for what are the requirements for some of the zoning considerations over a period of time? And again, we're not suggesting that any of this is done in the next 12 months, because that's not realistic. And that's not what we need in this particular area anyway. It's really a longer term plan, but there are some short-term opportunities and potential wins in the shorter term. If you do look at agriculture and tourism and potential residential expansion and those types of things are things that can happen over the next 5 years while some of these other things materialize. And so I would suggest that, yes, that is a conversation that does need to happen in working closely with planning. And that is part of the next steps in the summary. And I know I went through that very quickly for the short-term activities for implementation. Once we line up who the lead would be and how we would allocate resources, how we being the city going forward. I'm not sure if that answers your question appropriately.
Yeah, no, that's great. I do see the time that there's a sequence to this, right. And that's going to be really important. I guess quickly, Dawn, is that when we stumble as a city, as we sometimes along the way, we now have issues of urban boundaries and rural boundaries. I think we need to understand that I don't think this is going to require an expansion of urban boundaries into our area. It's going because I think that this can be done still within a rural boundary concept. Am I not correct, Craig? And can I not say that? Can I say that?
Yes. Yes.
Thanks. And we can talk more about it, but I think that's the picture we will give comfort to the rural areas as well. But as we continue to paint that canvas, so I'll let it go for now. I'd have a few other points, but I'd like to hear from others. Madam Chair.
Any other questions from committee members? I see that there's a few hands raised from members of the public. So before we move, I just want to make sure that Councillor Usharoff, your questions have been all answered, so that you have the opportunity. You're on mute.
We're coming back to the committee again, right?
Excellent. Yes, for comments only. Okay, so seeing no other questions, we are going to move to members of the public. James, I don't know if you can unmute. I see two hands raised, one from Mr. Farkas and one from Mr. Wolf. I don't know who raised their hand first. There's also a hands raised for Mr. Tolles. So I'll start from the top of my list, Mr. Farkas.
Yes,
James.
Madam,
okay, perfect.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Yeah, that was a very interesting presentation. Thank you. I live in Glen Burnie, so one of the residents of the rural area. I wanted to raise a few points and a few concerns that I have about the report. One is when only 78 residents are from the rural area that are surveyed in this, out of the 375, I would suggest that perhaps that is not a true sampling of the population of the rural area. And I would think to get more comprehensive input, there would have to be a broader surveying of the rural residents. The second thing is, I think, I haven't seen anywhere in this report, and I'm a little bit concerned around that, is the balance between the agricultural and the commercial and economic development. And also the fact that a lot of residents have moved into the rural areas for the tranquility and peacefulness that the rural area brings. So these are not necessarily farmers, they're just regular residents like me who have moved here because of the relative peace and quiet of the rural setting. So my question is how would this economic plan be balanced against, there has to be a balance. My concern is that the whole rural area will be overrun eventually with all sorts of parks and commercial developments and so on, and it's going to lose the essence of the rural experience that a lot of people who have moved out here want to live in. So how is that balance going to be struck? Is that through a rigorous zoning so that some areas are off limits to commercial development? Is it through other means that we can strike a balance? And that's my concern.
Ms. O'Blennis, I'm happy to let you answer to that, or Greg, if you have anything to respond.
Sure. Greg, would you like me to jump in and then you can augment, or vice versa?
Go ahead.
So thank you so much, Mr. Farkas, for your question, and certainly appreciate your question as a resident in rural Kingston. I mean, I think with any strategy, these considerations that you're highlighting and the reason why people live in rural areas is because of that peace and tranquility. And I think based on our work that we've done, we wouldn't see anything that would suggest that that would be compromised. Just as an example, one of the things that we looked at, so for the agricultural opportunities and some of the farmers, some of the things that can be looked at is even just some business support that can be provided to some of these farmers to be able to help them, you know, build their businesses a little bit further. And it doesn't mean that they're going to build, you know, global scaling companies. It's more just to help the businesses that are there, whether they're small operations or larger operations. And so that's the main area on the agricultural side is looking at that. There's a huge movement right now for succession planning, for example, with farmers and in the agricultural industry that needs to be considered. With 148 farms and an important part of the community in that area, we want to make sure that those lands continue in that way and in that use. When we look at the cluster development, an interesting statistic that I'm happy to share, when we worked with the GIS team with the city, our initial request was to identify plots of land that had 50 contiguous acres of land or more, because you want to have at least 50 acres for any type of business park to have any sort of critical mass. And they came back with 550 sites in rural Kingston that has more than 50 contiguous acres of land. And so we said, oh dear, well, we can't do anything with 500 different options for land. Let's scale that up to 100 acres of contiguous land. And there's actually about half, so about 220 plots of land with more than 100 contiguous acres of land. In the strategy that you see, or that will be released, there's actually only about 10 sites that we selected that have 100 acres or more of contiguous land in close proximity to the hamlets, the 6 hamlets that are identified, and in particular 5 hamlets which have a greater population or close to 1,000 people. And so I again, I appreciate your perspective and certainly understand your concern. I don't think, though, based on our work and our recommendations and the lands and the areas of lands, that there will be that the concern of the quality of rural Kingston will be jeopardized in any way because of the nature of there's such a breadth of land in rural Kingston, and there's such a limited amount that have been selected for potential sites for these types of developments that we would not see that becoming an issue in certainly a very long period of time, or any foreseeable future in our generation. Craig, I don't know if you wanted to add to that.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm not a land use planner by profession. That's not my area of expertise. But I would just comment that, again, that balance of sort of the urban, rural, and the quality of life is actually something we absolutely don't want to play with. That's actually part of the attraction of Kingston. Again, one of the things we have that many other communities don't have is we actually have an amazing rural. We have amazing urban downtown core, and we have suburban. So when I'm looking to attract talent in the future for our businesses in our urban part of the city, I can present, a complete selection of opportunity, how you want to live your life. And I think that's a really important feature, a selling feature of our community, and something we absolutely want to continue. It's not something we want to change.
Thank you for the very comprehensive response. I believe it does respond to Mr. Farkas' question. Mr. Farkas, is there any other question, or can I move to the next member of the public? I'll just give you the opportunity to respond back.
Yes, can you hear me, Madam Chair? Yes. So, yeah, thank you for those answers. The one thing I would recommend, if from what you indicated, there are 10 sites of 100 continuous acres near hamlets that could be proposed for commercial or development or these industrial parks, that the people around those areas, I think, there has to be a lot of consultation around that to make sure it's a win-win for everyone, and that these parks aren't developed over the objections of many of the people that have to live nearby. So I think as long as things are done with proper consultation and respect for the needs and wishes of the people that will be impacted in the adjacent areas, then I think it can work out okay. But we've seen instances where maybe that has not been done optimally in the past, and I think care and consideration has to be given for that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good comment.
Thank
Good
you.
comment. Thank you.
Now we'll move on to Mr. Wolf.
Have to unmute. There we are. I hope.
We can hear you. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am a rural resident, and I know that rural economy has been a concern of this committee for a long time, and so this initiative is important, and it's a very interesting report. I have 4 comments. First, broadband was a top concern in the consultations, but I don't see it mentioned in the slides. In fact, it was probably the biggest thing anybody thought would be necessary for economic development in the rural area. Second, the cover note says that rural Kingston is defined as 2 completely rural census tracts, as well as portions of 3 that are a mix of urban and rural. But when you go through the regular recommendations, it's not always that those distinctions aren't always clear or even made. The rural area is really big, so it'd be nice to know where the clusters are, where the hamlets are, the possible industrial parks. I agree with the comments made by Mr. Farkas, and like him, I was not entirely assured by the answers he received. Basically, it's really hard to know what any of this means without a map. It's really hard to know what it means without seeing how it would fit with the existing official plan. I've lost track, for example, of the replacement for the estate residential category and whether that has anything to do with the ideas being proposed here. Of course, sadly, as Councillor Oosterhoff knows, many of us in the rural area have come to see the official plan as a little flexible if it comes to things like the Unity Spa. So maybe I'm asking for too much and wanting to see how it fits with the official plan. I am curious of whether this would incorporate the ideas being proposed for the McAdoo's Lane area, or is this a different idea? But the bottom line is that the rural area is not just a vacant area for development with 100-acre plots here and there. People live here, they play here, and as Mr. Farkas said, we don't want economic development to undermine this. Finally, a small point, one of the slides talks about food security and COVID-19, and a particular focus on the importance of local food supplies and resiliency. That, if I might put on my academic hat here, that's fashionable and trendy to say that. But really, if you think about the full range of things that people in Kingston eat and buy, most of those aren't produced in the rural area of Kingston now, and they're never going to be. We don't get oranges locally, for example. We have some wonderful products available locally in August and September, sometimes into October, but really for the rest of it, resiliency in our food supplies means that the supply chains that extend across Canada, throughout North America, that's what resiliency in our food means. It always means that, and COVID-19 hasn't changed it very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Laura, I'll let you start with an answer, and then I'll let Craig jump in to supplement as required.
I think Craig took his off mute first. Craig, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Madam.
I know, sorry, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Certainly, I can kick off the broadband, and certainly we have heard, and the data is very clear that that was the strongest concern and the number one importance. I don't meet with Councillor Oosterhoff. He doesn't raise broadband with me. I can tell you that there is a public there's a report coming to council. I think it'll be on the 17th of November, which is the next council, not tomorrow night, but the following meeting, which will outline the work underway. I can tell you that my office and Utilities Kingston are working very diligently to address that, both as part of the City of Kingston and Utilities Kingston, but also with other partners. And we recognize that, again, that is a crucial piece of infrastructure. One of the interesting pieces of data was about home-based businesses and how home-based businesses are a critical component of rural communities across the world. The growth of those home-based businesses is made possible by connectivity. And certainly we heard, and Councillor Stoff, I'm sure his phone has been rung off the hook over the last several months, as people have worked from home, but also now have had to have homeschooling, and e-learning, e-healthcare. All of these have continued to put even a greater burden on our systems and connectivity. So it is a number one priority for my office related to rural. So maybe I'll pass the other components on to Laura, and happy to augment after she's commented.
Thanks, Craig. So, and again, thank you, Mr. Wolf, for your comments. A couple of things. So on the broadband, and I know Craig's just highlighted that in terms of the work being done with the city and Utilities Kingston at the moment. Broadband was not included in a recommendation in this particular component because it's included in the integrated plan. We felt that it was deserving of a separate category, actually, in the integrated strategy, generally for Kingston as a whole, and notably in rural Kingston. So it's definitely included in the recommendation, and certainly duly noted that is part of it. I just wanted to highlight that. The other comments on the development locations, and certainly fair comments, it would be helpful to know where those locations are. We're not in a position right now to be able to disclose that because there's still work that needs to be done to be able to assess the opportunity. And as Councillor Oosterhoff had highlighted or asked earlier in the discussion, where the role is of planning and some additional due diligence is required before really finalizing any of those locations. But your points are certainly well noted. On the local food, it's really important as we're doing these exercises. The reality is we are in the middle of a pandemic, and while it may seem as though some of the food that we eat today is not locally produced, there is an opportunity to shift our thinking in terms of where we grow our food, where we eat our food, and there's tremendous innovations occurring in things like aquaponics and vertical farming, in greenhouses, and in other ways that we can grow vegetation for vegetables, because we do need to be considering this in what's happening globally. And we wouldn't be doing our jobs if we didn't highlight that as something that could at least be considered. And maybe that's something that won't be explored, or there won't be any uptake. But we do think that there is an opportunity because of the global focus right now on food security and supply chain security. And in particular, because of the opportunity and the geographical location of Kingston, we would be remiss if we did not highlight that as an opportunity for those that are interested in getting into farming and looking at taking advantage of some of the innovative ways that we can look at producing different types of vegetation and food for supplying our communities and other areas in that massive distribution cluster that you have access to those 14.5 million people. There really is an economic development opportunity, and that may or may not be explored, but that's why it's highlighted, because there are ways of maximizing the potential with that beyond what's taking place today.
And Madam Chair, I'd only augment by saying if Mr. Wolf wants maps, we've got lots of maps. One of the things we haven't been able to do and will be included as part of the complete strategy is the consultants, Laura and her team, are very data driven. They've been working, as you mentioned, with our GIS departments. We have maps with layers and layers of data that we'll be happy to share, and will be part of that final version. Just in terms of the comments around food security, I don't disagree with his comments. I would say though that Council did identify food security pre-COVID as a priority, and almost food insecurity of some of our urban residents, and understanding how we can link our farmers with those in our urban centers to provide opportunity for farmers, but also food for our residents.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Councillor Shroff, I saw your hand, but I do want to give the time to members of the public to voice their questions before we come back to members of the committee, if that's okay with you. Mr. Wolf, I believe this answered your 4 pillars, your 4 questions. Is there anything you'd like to add?
I think the answer about innovation in food production is great. Sun Harvest Greenhouse in Glen Burnie would agree with you that there are interesting opportunities. They've been there for years. It has nothing to do with COVID-19. I just think that's a red herring. Okay,
thank you. I will now ask Mr. Brian Tolles to join. I don't know if, I don't see you on my screen. Okay, you just appeared. Perfect.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Madam Chair, members of the committee, good evening. I also had a couple of questions, and one was on the 375/78. So that's 20% of the rural people had spoken. That was that a weighted thing when you were doing your percentages for that? Like, what did you use for? Did you split that up, or is it just all lumped together in the this in your percentages for what you were looking for taken off of the total of 375, or did you split it out and try to figure out what the rural resident was looking for compared to what the average person was looking for? Understanding that we need to, if we want people to move into and become part of the rural area, they have to have a voice also. But I was just curious as to what you did with that percentage numbers. My second thing would be, in there quite a bit, there's a lot about agriculture, kind of dear to my heart. I've been doing it for a long time also. Farms range in our city from several thousand acres to maybe 1 or 2 acres. So I guess my question would be, what was your thoughts on support for those? You said support, but what are you going to carry for support for large and small, or what are you looking for there? Are you looking to help the larger animal places with an abattoir area if we need that? Are you looking for trucking? Are you looking for refrigeration for the vegetable people who are going to try and do a food to plate type of thing? Curious to hear your answers on those two things.
Turning to you, Laura.
Great. Thanks, Madam Chair, and thank you for the question, Mr. Toll. So just on the survey, so in the survey, there was 375 respondents in Kingston overall, and we asked in the survey where they were located in terms of postal code so that we could understand where the respondents were actually located from. So that allowed us to be able to pull and extract that information to confirm that 78 of the 375, or as you mentioned, 20%, came from rural Kingston. And that is actually the same percentage of the total number of Kingstonians and the percentage that live in rural Kingston. And of course, more consultation certainly can always be helpful, but we were feeling fairly positive about this breakdown. So that's, I just wanted to respond to that point. On this, on the opportunities to help, that's a great question. And to be honest, I guess the question would be, what do farmers like yourselves need the most? What we've seen in other areas, and again, additional due diligence would be required on this to really land on what can be done. But when we look at economic development support that currently exists for businesses, and they range from traditional businesses to high-tech companies, there's support programs in the sense of, helping businesses with their business plans. There's help and support that's emerging for succession planning, as I mentioned. There may be a need for, accessing equipment or trying to be able to find programs to be able to help with those types of things. And you're right on the sizes. It does really vary. And that's why, in terms of the organized number of businesses that show up in business counts, it's drastically different than the number of farms that actually exist in Kingston, because there's 148 that have more than $30,000 in annual revenue. However, there's likely even more than that would have less, to your point, that would have 1 to 2 acres, and others that would have 3,000. And so there's a variety of ways that economic development support can be provided without necessarily knowing what the farmers are needing. That's kind of the next step. I would say, Mr. Tolles, is having a conversation, which we'd be very happy to have a conversation with you to understand what you would suggest would be most helpful to you as a business owner and as a farmer in the area, and some of your peers. So I would throw that out to you. If you would be interested in a conversation, I'd actually be very happy to chat with you about that, because that would be part of the next step in gaining a greater understanding of what specifically would be needed. And again, we've seen a number of things in other areas, but we do need to understand from the community what is missing most for you that would be helpful to building and sustaining your operation and your businesses.
And Madam Chair, I would only I guess, add to Laura's comment by saying that just like in, for example, we're doing a lot of work right now in the hotel business, hotel sector. accommodations. Obviously, in Kingston, we have some big players, some big chains. We also have some small sort of mom and pop, family-owned operations that are quite small. Each of those has a different need, but again, by identifying there is a need, by meeting with those business owners to understand what they want. Is it access to technology, adoption of technology? That's a common activity in the rural sector or the retail sector and accommodation and food services. People don't realize how technology-driven agriculture is. It's an awful lot of innovation happening on farms. But as you said, it may actually lean more heavily towards some communal infrastructure. You mentioned about freezing capacity or other sort of shared. You mentioned abattoir. Big issue. When you look at the breakdown of farms in Kingston, I think it was 22% were dairy or beef cattle operations. So a big part of that farm sector. So again, this is the next step of the strategy is implementation, and that actually is done when we actually get down and meet with farmers, the different sectors, and say, okay, what do you want, and what do you need, and then we design the programs. We're going to have to source money for that, but again, we have teams within the city that develop grants. That again would be something we'd approach the both federal and provincial levels of government.
Thank you. Mr. Tolles, is there anything you'd like to add before I turn back to the committee members? Okay, I will turn back to committee members. Thank you for everyone that asked questions. I believe it really provided a wealthy conversation with quite comprehensive topics. I know Councillor Shroff, you raised your hand at some point during the conversation. Would you like to pitch in?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the questions too. And I think they're really great because it shows that in these conversations we can come to a better understanding of these things, because some of it's very new to us, and it's when we dialogue together that we can understand better and appreciate some of the goals. And there's really a lot of potential here, and opportunity is really what I see. I do want to, I wish Allison maybe would respond a little bit to the food security issue, because I'm surprised that, Bob, that you would say that the pandemic doesn't. The pandemic does point to our issues, and council saw it even before that. Kingston is an incredible city with incredible number of community gardens that are very successful in producing an abundance of food for food kitchens, and I think they're for sale for restaurants, and it's something that is absolutely, when you know about it, you will say, wow, it is. And I am someone that, and we are all here very aware of the brilliance of our farming community. I think Allison and Charlie can speak to that, and Brian, I know that there is, and maybe we could actually ask for what are the best practices we saw elsewhere, because in other communities there is some significant opportunity for food growth and development and manufacturing for that, and I believe it's here as well. And I think that we are an untapped resource. Our farming community is absolutely, I believe, brilliant, and the potential extends even beyond the rural area. We have the South Frontenac, and so that's something that I maybe, if I could stop for 1 second, Madam Chair, and ask about best practices elsewhere, but related even to food security, which for me is also an incredibly important file. So can we address that, Laura?
Councillor Shroff, these are excellent points. Very interesting conversation, absolutely. Food security is one pillar. I'd rather not dig too deep on that, because it is one pillar of the economic development strategy and not necessarily a
Okay.
a philosophical debate on pro and against agriculture and food sustainability in itself. I do recognize the importance of having this type of philosophical conversation and the depth of the framework and what other jurisdictions are doing, but perhaps that's a whole conversation in itself that merits a full hour. So just to keep us on target for today, if it's okay to kind of come back to this specific matter, if you don't mind.
No, thank you for that. And I just wanted to make sure we know that this is a big thing and not
yes.
So thank you for that and for that. Can we point to other communities? Can I have that question answered? That's the one. It was something that would give us a model of other areas. Perhaps Craig knows that. He mentioned that, and I actually don't even. Well, I do. I know that their Guelph and Ottawa has some, but would we be able to point it to something actually?
So, your Chair Conway, absolutely, Councillor. We can point to some very innovative communities close by. I think in Prince Edward County, but you also look at Salt Spring Island in British Columbia. You can look down in the States. You can certainly look in Europe. Some very dynamic and creative cooperative programs that have been developed. Again, I'm a firm believer in stealing other people's good ideas from other jurisdictions and applying them here. No purpose, no sense in reinventing the wheel. I think there's great opportunity here for, and again, this is the excitement. We don't want to presuppose to drive the agenda of the Rural Advisory Committee, but this gives you and the community something to dig into, and that was the whole real purpose of this economic strategy.
Thank you.
Thank you. There are some, as we close this conversation, there are 2 points that I'd like to make myself in terms of the agritourism. I think this also puts a finger on something very interesting, and I'd like to see it tied in maybe more closely with recreational usage of the rural areas. I found that was really missing from the report, but that is just a comment from my perspective, from my own lens on this. So I think there would be some potential there to explore maybe a little further. But essentially, I'd really be interested to know what are the next steps for you and what can the Rural Advisory Committee do? I mean, we've been exceptionally grateful to have you, Craig, and your team coming to us twice, and I feel it's such an interesting and important strategy, and we want to be involved all the way, mostly because it ties in so nicely with broadband. So what can we do? How can we see you come back to us again? There's a few possibilities here, but I want to hear from you first as to how you see this unfolding.
So thanks, Madam Chair. Certainly one of the pieces, and it's Laura did sort of go over fairly quickly when she talked about implementation and sort of pre-implementation. And one of the pieces, you have Councillor Oosterhoff and Councillor Bohm representing the rural parts of Kingston. Again, there's a long list of activities. Activities cost money, and they need resources, staff to sort of oversee and execute on these. One of the things that we are going to have to look at to make sure that this isn't a document that just gets filed in a filing cabinet is that this committee and this strategy has resources. And I'm not suggesting that all of it will come from the city. I would say, what we've had significant success with other sort of initiatives like this strategy, and I'm thinking of the workforce development strategy, where we've secured hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars in grant money. We're very good at that at the city, and I would say that is going to play an important role. But again, you have to have an idea to write a grant to secure the money, but then you also have to have somebody who's going to actually implement it. So there's going to be some work and some discussions, and some of them will be at the staff level, and certainly some of them will be at the council table to discuss. Rural's a priority, and who's going to execute. Certainly, Director Brendan Forrest is on the call as well. This will likely fall under his leadership, with the business support being part of his portfolio. But again, that's to be determined, and we look forward to direction from council.
Excellent. I believe that's what is part of our toolkit at this committee is to put a motion forward, a motion of support, perhaps to ask, for example, for council to give consideration during their 2021 budget deliberation on this specific initiative, because it's an initiative of importance for the Rural Advisory Committee. Those are the possibility of motions we can put forward, but at the end of the day, we definitely do not want to undermine any of your efforts. And we want to bring to council things that are helpful and not undermining your work that you're doing on other fronts to securing funds elsewhere either. So this is where I'd like to hear from you as to what type of motions could be suitable, and from there work with the committee members into crafting the specific wording, as well as with the assistance of James, to see what that could look like. Allison, I saw your hand raised. I think you have a very on point comment to make on this. Oh, you're muted.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Just quickly, I just feel it needs to be said, especially when you're talking about reaching out to other municipalities. We here in the city of Kingston are right next door to the county of Frontenac, and their economic development platform is all about strengthening. They see the value of agriculture in that municipality as well. They have a different approach. And Mr. Desjardins made a very good point saying that we don't want to reinvent the wheel. I certainly hope that there is consultation with a municipality right next door to make sure that we can leverage work perhaps that they've already done, that, you know, that can really make it cohesive. Because in the county of Frontenac, their approach is to work with quite small farmers, and it might be interesting to see where that leads, and the opportunity for the city of Kingston to sort of open that up if they're going to support farmers to have that definition of farming be a little bit broader as well. Yeah, I just hope that we're not missing out our next door neighbors who are very much focused on this very, very similar front. Thank you.
Madam Chair, 100%. Allison, you're 100% correct. We actually have met with both the county and also South Frontenac. They are very, very excited and eager to collaborate with us as we are with them. So I think you're right. There's the money will go further when we work together. I also, and I have to apologize, I was remiss in not referencing Kingston Economic Development and their important role in this. I don't want to say that the Brandon is going to do all the work. Certainly, these recommendations leverage up into the integrated economic development strategy. Kingston Economic Development has been active in this space for years. They have significant expertise on their team. So again, it's many hands make light work.
Thank you. So this concludes the matter for tonight. Thank you very much for being here and for presenting this very, very interesting initiative and strategy. We certainly hope to hear more about it in the future and see how we can perhaps support the efforts, provide an area of consultation as this continues to move forward. And we're always very eager to keep the discussion going and flowing on this, because it truly can have a meaningful impact for the rural area in Kingston. So thank you. And I will turn to the next business item to keep us on schedule. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Okay, so now we have the animal bylaw review. I don't know who specifically will be speaking to that.
Good evening, Madam Chair. My name is Kyle Campo. I'm the Manager of Licensing and Enforcement with the City of Kingston. Accompanied with me tonight is Dan Hazel. He's the Supervisor of Licensing and Enforcement, along with Derek O'Shea, who is our Licensing and Enforcement Coordinator. So staff are excited as we were beginning the review of bylaw number 2004-144, which is the animal bylaw. This bylaw sets out the regulations for animal licensing, impoundment, keeping of animals, animal behavior, and regulates kennels and breeders. Staff are seeking to make changes to the bylaw to encourage responsible pet ownership, along with clarifying any ambiguities. A public engagement strategy will be undertaken throughout the month of November. This report contains several proposed changes and updates to the bylaw for which public input will be sought after. Staff is seeking feedback from the committee on the proposed changes and updates, as well as suggestions for any stakeholder groups that we should be consulting with during the updates in the public engagement period. There are issues that are being considered that have a greater effect for the rural residents. That's including backyard hens, the keeping of pigeons, and livestock at large and trespassing. So we have put in a few sections at the end of this report that have to do with this 3 specific details for the committee, but we're also interested in any other input as we're just beginning this review stage. So that's sort of just a quick caption of it, but any input is definitely sought after right now from the committee.
Excellent. So I'm turning to committee members. If you have any specific questions on the report that was submitted to our attention, I'll give you a few minutes to think, manifest your desire to ask a burning question. Councillor Usharov.
Thank you again, Madam Chair. Thank you for the presentation. I guess I do want to, I'm glad to hear that there will be stakeholder or public engagement in the month of November. I do hope that, I actually think that that's short. And I hope that we can hear from more people tonight on that. This is something that it just seems in the rural area, Kyle, that it is just that way. We need to recognize we are a remote community and word travels slowly. Running 2 campaigns, I know there's lots and lots of animals in the rural area. Everybody's got them. And so we really want to get this right. I hope it's not rushed, that the public has input and that there is, and Ryan is not here, but we would completely agree that there is a rural component that recognizes that one bylaw does not fit all. I don't know if I can say that strong enough right in this form. And so I do hope others address this, even in all the areas. And maybe, Kyle, you can go to extra efforts to assure us of that and maybe give us examples of that, because when, yeah, absolutely, pigeons and chickens and cats and dogs, they're very important to us in the rural area. And improper limitations will become so inflamed so quickly. And so can you assure us of that we're not, the timeline is not going to be a rapid implementation of a bylaw, I hope.
Thank you, and through you, Madam Chair. Great point, Councillor Usharov. I think this has been a delayed bylaw coming to the attention of this committee and to council as well. There's been many revisions that we need to incorporate into this review. So by no means are we intending to rush this. And whether we can have a report or an information report, or I can talk to Derek about something that brings back the information that we've collected to this committee before further process.
Yes. So where would this bylaw be approved? Is it through the administrative policy? Because it would be interesting for us to be able to put our eyes on it as things evolve and progress, because as Councillor Usharov mentioned, there is some very inherent differences between the rural and urban areas here, and possibly how we define animals, domestic animals versus livestock. It's completely different. So there's definitely interest here in being able to have our eyes on that, just to make sure that we do respect the inherent nature of the rural areas here. So yeah, just wanted to mention that, but I do have questions myself. I mean, you don't need to answer to specifically my request to put our eyes on this again. I think, and I know it's probably not intentional, it could have been with the eyes I was reading this report when I read it, it felt punitive. It felt that we were coming at it through a punitive lens, and I wasn't sure why. I wasn't sure what the goal was and what had happened for us to come at it in a punitive manner. establishing some very drastic measures. So do we have data and information that specifically may speak of individuals getting bitten by dogs in the rural areas more than ever before? Is there, like, what do you have?
Thank you, and through you, Madam Chair. We do have the information that regards specific dog attacks and locations. We're looking at different municipalities to do comparisons as well. But this report is not to do anything to do, I should say, to be punitive in nature. We're looking at it strictly based on the feedback that we have gotten from residences in the rural community over the past couple of years, specific issues that our department has been dealing with no means of regulating it, and to do with public safety as well. So that is something that we can get that information for this committee for specific information to do with the rural regions. But for those specific numbers, Madam Chair, at this time, I don't have them.
Okay, excellent. No, thank you. It's exceptionally important because of the difference between the perceived safety, the perceived risk, and the actual real risk. So I'm a strong proponent of don't fix what's not broken. And mostly because it's coming at it through somewhat of a punitive way, the language used somewhat in this report, like, to encourage responsible pet ownership. Could we define what is responsible versus irresponsible? And can we define what is responsible for a domestic animal and responsible for a livestock farming? So I think there are some really important definitions that need to come in play here. And I realize this is not, I don't mean to put you on the spot, definitely, but to rethink of the strategy here as to what end, to what goal, and what are we trying to solve? What is the problem statement and what is the value proposition here? That was completely lost for me, but I don't want to come at it through like a teacher lens, not that I know very much of it. I'll turn to Charlie and Allison. I don't know if you have any questions or anything to add. I don't want to portray the full Rural Advisory Committee with my lens of how I perceive this. So I just want to turn to you. Please, Charlie. You're still on mute. There you go.
It's interesting. My feelings were exactly what you just said. And I'm thinking, I didn't even want to talk about it because of that. I thought that maybe that's just very one-sided the way I'm looking at it. Why would you want to change it unless you have numbers to say that there's been so many lawsuits or people bitten or people trampled by a single cow that was in the backyard? I just don't know where this is all going. I have never heard any civil unrest in our neighborhoods over wild animals biting people or whatever. I find it strange that this is all coming out. I haven't even heard anything in the news to promote this. Interesting.
Thank you. Well, that's certainly a compliment, Mr. Compo, because there's definitely a thirst for more. So you're keeping us on our toes. So I'll let, I don't know if Councillor Usharoff or Allison has anything to add, but my last point would certainly be to establish clear differences between rural and urban, domestic versus livestock. So the no trespassing for livestock, I feel, is completely unnecessary, and that there is real economic value in getting your animal back. If your cows have escaped, you want them back because there's a price tag, and a quite high price tag, in getting them back. Slapping them with a bylaw, with a fine, is not an incentive. It's not a motivation at all. It's just, I really don't see the value, because they want their animal back ASAP. There is no doubt about that. So I felt it was really unnecessary. I am not a farmer myself. I've never experienced my animals getting out of a field myself, but I'm not sure that it's necessary to go to that extent. So I'd like to hear more about the rationale behind it and events that may have occurred that led to this as being a necessary measure.
Madam Chair, I believe Mr. Hazel has something to add from a moment ago, if that's possible.
I didn't hear you. Could you repeat?
Oh, I was just going to mention that Mr. Hazel had something to ask or add to the discussion from a moment ago.
Oh, thank you. I just noticed the two hands raised. Excellent. Please, please join in, Mr. Hazel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First comment I want to make in relation to the comments about it being punitive in nature. So currently in Ontario, we already have the Dog Owner Liability Act that is in force and in effect across the entire province. Within that legislation, it already provides animal control tools and mechanisms to seize animals that have attacked or owners that act in a menacing behavior. Some points of the bylaw are to add regulations into the municipal bylaw, which would alleviate our requirement to utilize the Dog Owner Liability Act. And sometimes those cases draw out long durations at court and take out a lot of resources with court time and prosecutors' assistance with those types of files. Having it in our bylaw would allow us to do more voluntary compliance and education through the bylaw versus utilizing the Dog Owner Liability Act, which is a more punitive in nature piece of legislation than the bylaw would be with proposed regulations. And the second comment I would make in relation to livestock, the municipality, we do receive complaints on a regular basis, sometimes in the spring and summertime, of such animals like horses and cows that have been at large or that are on the highway. And from a public safety perspective, they are interfering with motor vehicles on the road. And we just want to have a regulation in the bylaw that if it's a repeat offense, if it's the same farm or the same cows or the same horses that are continuously at large and putting the public at risk on the highways, then we want to have a mechanism or a tool to follow up appropriately with those potential owners. One of the guiding principles of animal control is voluntary compliance. We don't want to issue charges or go down any sort of path along that line unless it's warranted after voluntary compliance warnings have been provided. Currently with livestock, there's the only regulation in the animal bylaw speaks to not allowing livestock in a residential property. For example, having a cow or a pig in a residential property within the city. And that's currently the only regulations that we have that govern livestock. And the last comment I'll make is in relation to statistics about dog attacks. We have seen across the municipality a spike in dog attacks, and it's been kind of consistently in the summer times. One of the interesting things with our service is that we took over animal control across the entire municipality in about 2017, at the end of 2017, beginning of 2018, to where we were just enforcing animal control in this area. So after we've taken over citywide, we finally were in a position to collect accurate data on dog attacks and incidences of animal control of that nature. And sometimes in the summer, last summer, for example, in August, we had one officer receive a total of 19 dog attack investigations in the month of August. Now that's in the rural area, and that's in the urban area in a combination. And we just wanted to have these, we just wanted to update with the bylaw to reflect current times and ensure that there was mechanisms for animal control officers to do the appropriate enforcement that they're required to do to keep public safety, to minimize these incidences and be able to follow up through responsible pet ownership. Essentially, at the end of the day, responsible pet ownership guides animal control services. Our main thing is to ensure that pets are registered, that pet owners are acting faithfully and in good conscience to their animals, meaning they're getting them spayed and neutered, microchipped, seeking care when required. And the other piece of legislation that's in effect province-wide is the PAWS, Provincial Animal Welfare Service legislation, cutely named. And there are great components of that allow those officers to enforce that legislation, but we're looking at adding some potential standard of care mechanisms to allow our officers to order people, for example, to take a vet or an animal that looks injured to get care.
Thank you. That was very, very useful information. Thank you for providing all of that on the spot like that. I do see some questions from members of the public. So I'll turn towards the members of the public and then come back for a final kind of conversations with the rural advisory members. Mr. Tolles.
Chair, before
oh, yes.
Oh, Ms. Shannon had a question, so we should probably deal with that first before the public.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I did not see your hand. I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. We can circle back. Let Brian speak and then we can circle back. That's totally fine.
Okay. Okay, sounds good. Brian, Mr. Tolles, you're on. Well, your microphone is still off.
There we go. Technology and myself get along in a reasonably, not always good. My, listening to what the comments of the bylaw officer was just saying, I would like to just put a couple of things in there as comments. My farm is next to the KMP trail. I have had trail users on occasion decide that they think that my side of the trail is a little more interesting than the other side. And when they leave a gate open and my cattle get out of no response of my own and no problem of my own, I really would like to know that I'm not going to be fined for something I had no control over. So there needs to be some place in there for that. Or if a car goes off that road and goes through that fence and lets those cows onto that road, that is no longer the farmer's issue. That is extenuating circumstances that I think needs to be written into legislation, because as we all know, once legislation is written, it can be interpreted many different ways. So we need to make sure that we have room in there for some reasonable cause that a farmer or a livestock owner has a chance to be able to refute a few things that maybe go against them with other thing. If it's neglected fences on a regular basis where the cattle just are not being kept in the neglect, then sure, there needs to be something done for that. But a lot of times there's extenuating circumstances, and I really don't want to have a fine for X number of dollars per animal. If I've got 500 sheep, I don't, but if I did, I certainly don't want to have that fine looking at me because somebody left the gate open. So that would be one thing I would suggest for that, for the livestock side of it. The which is more what my comments were going to be, was more on the livestock side. I've never seen any place that, or had heard of any place having fines for livestock being outside of their fences. This is a new one for me, and I'm just a little concerned on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tolles. I don't know if there's a response from Mr. Campo or Mr. Hazel on that.
Yes, through you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Tolles. We appreciate your feedback. I think first and foremost, in terms of any kind of enforcement action, the city's model is always education before enforcement. So we would be providing education to any owners that came into a situation, or at least working with the individual or the owner to figure out the situations where, if that is happening, obviously that's a unique situation for yourself. We're aware of that and would work with you through that specific situation. I think in terms of what we're putting forward is to do with recidivism, to do with the same situations that we're having reoccurring themes with some owners with, that just blatantly don't take due diligence for their property. And we have nothing for, I guess, our authority to be able to regulate or go forward with enforcing these kind of situations that are reoccurring throughout the year. And we're seeing more of these situations come into play.
Okay, my only comment to that would be that that would need to be written in the legislation someplace, that it's not a single entity type of a thing where if they get it once that fine can be levied. There needs to be something in there to kind of protect people. That's a one-off thing. I understand where you're coming from, but legislation, when I deal with provincially, listening to these things and commenting on them on a provincial level, that is one thing we need to be careful of, is that we don't put in place a legislation that could almost be abused the other way too. So we need to be careful of that, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Tolles. We appreciate that, and we're definitely taking that into consideration. We have our enforcement coordinator taking notes, so we'll make sure that we incorporate your suggestions and your comments into our further research. Again, I think it comes off as a punitive in nature report. I guess, you know, this is coming from the bylaw enforcement department. So I mean, it can feel that way because a lot of our concerns are through regulations, and that's how we we sort of deal with our matters are by bylaws and by enforcing, right? That's the nature of what we do. So we're not trying to come off like this is a hard hit for the rural area. I think that the main idea for us as staff to come forward to this committee is to make sure that we definitely include this committee and get the feedback in non-punitive measures, just as a collective whole conversation.
Thank you for precising that, because that was my feeling as I was reading it too. I was like, I feel like the words and the sentences and etc. are coming at it a little bit with that punitive angle, but I didn't feel that was really the sentiment that wanted to be portrayed. So I'm really glad that you're clarifying that. And that's exactly why having conversations is sometimes a lot more fruitful, because of the interpretation of, you know, between the lines. Sometimes we read things, and so it's very fruitful to have you to have your team here with us today to clarify these things. I do want to turn to Mr. Wolf. He also has his hands raised.
Madam Chair, before we get to Mr. Wolf, I believe Mr. Hazel had a comment he'd like to add.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Please, Mr. Hazel.
Through you, Madam Chair. It was a great question by Mr. Tolles, and our thought process behind the scenes when we talk about writing the legislation, there's a lot of language that you can use, such as direct or indirect, cause or permit. I think in the case of a livestock violation, an officer would show up and do our standard investigation. And if we determine that someone else interfered with that gate, for example, and you weren't the cause or you did not permit that offense, we wouldn't even be looking at enforcement at that point. It'd be more or less working with that property owner to make them aware of what occurred, to see what we could do to prevent that, such as maybe adding a lock to that fence and putting a sign up or something along those lines. We really want to focus on the like offenses that would be caused or permitted by a potential person that owns livestock. And if it's a repeat offense and it occurs after all those voluntary compliance and education has occurred, we'd be looking to go for potential violation under the bylaw.
And when you write a bylaw, I'm sorry, I have a question to fall back on that. And Mr. Tolles, if I'm not portraying this right, just let me know. In the bylaw, would you write those specific measures that have to be taken before, like the kind of sequencing of it? Is that written out specifically?
Typically, that we wouldn't put the processes right into the bylaw. Those would be like more of a procedure of enforcement that we would have on the back end. So once we introduce or pass this legislation, one component would be training our officers on the new regulations and establishing policy and procedure. And that's what my role is with the officers, to ensure is that that policy and procedure gets followed and we apply the legislation as its intention as we design it. So the spirit of the law essentially in this, when it comes to this regulation, would be to ensure that education is there, voluntary compliance is achieved, with the notion that we're not trying to penalize someone like Mr. Tolles had mentioned, someone that has a gate in place and somebody else interferes with that gate and they cause that violation. Essentially in that situation, that person that opened the gate might be the person that would be able to receive the violation for it because they caused that violation, not the property owner.
Thank you for precising that. Okay, James, can I move forward to Mr. Wolf? Okay, I'll take this as a yes. Mr. Wolf, please.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had two comments having read the text. The first comes from something that I didn't know about in my previous 30 years living in this area. And that was the phrase about feeding of wildlife. And I've discovered that people in the rural area sometimes have deer feeding stations. And I suspect they have a deer feeding station because they're hunters. And they want to attract the deer to come to a specific place. And so far as I can tell, that's legal in provincial rules. So I'm curious how that might get dealt with by this proposed bylaw. And second, and the thing that first struck me was the reference to hens. Within a kilometer or so of me, I know of at least 3 people who keep hens, so they must be ubiquitous in the rural area. Maybe not in the parts of the rural area that we heard about earlier this evening that are more urban than rural, but in the true rural area, I suspect an awful lot of people keep hens. And the idea of being eligible to obtain a license, that's the language in the report, might strike them as curious. they would probably prefer to say that they were exempted from any need to obtain a license, and that would just solve a problem because they probably wouldn't go and get a license anyway. And in particular, one of my neighbors who keeps hens, I said, what do you think about this? And he said, look at section 4.14 of the current bylaw, which says it doesn't apply to people who have more than 5 acres. So I'm wondering whether you would propose changing that section. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Wolf, for your question. Through you, Madam Chair, I'm going to defer in a second to Mr. Hazel for the back end of that portion. But in terms of the hunting, or I guess feeding of wildlife, exemptions can be added to this bylaw in terms of, I guess, specific hunting situations, or the feed or the spread for the hunting or trapping animals. Those can be considered as exemptions. You are correct in terms of we do not currently have that as regulations in the bylaw. So it's something that we can consider, but I'll defer to Mr. Hazel for the last portion.
Okay, through you, Madam Chair. So in relation to the backyard hen piece, this is an outstanding item that we first came to the Rural Advisory Committee, I believe back in 2018. Back in that time frame, there was identification that our section 4.17 subclause I of the animal control bylaw, it was written in a way that had some unintended consequences towards rural properties. Essentially, what it's lacking in the current bylaw is it does not permit a location that is in the rural area to allow them to have backyard hens. So essentially, in layman's terms, any residential property that is in the rural area or beside an agricultural property wouldn't qualify or be permitted to have a permit for backyard hens. So we're going to touch up section 4.17 to clarify that, to allow any residential property that is in the rural area the same permissions that it applies to the rest of the city. And the second thing about section, I believe it was 4.14 and 4.13, the current exemption in there states that no, it doesn't apply to agricultural properties or to a person of 5 or more acres. And we can definitely look at adjusting that to make that more clarified to whatever we want.
Thank you. I believe this solves the questions from members of the public. I will turn back now to members of the committee. Allison, I missed you earlier, so you're on.
Thanks, Madam Chair. The more we speak about this review of the animal bylaw, it seems there's more and more questions because there's so many one-off situations we can all think of. Would it be reasonable to extend the period for public engagement in order to try and have a little bit more feedback, input, so that we can try to cover as many bases as we possibly can before such a bylaw is ratified? Does it have to be completed in November? We're in November now. That's really, really tight.
Yeah, I would like to support everything that you've mentioned. Also, because it has to be extremely meaningful, and we require a lot of attention to this because it is a sensitive matter. Owning animal, and at least domestically, is a very emotional component. Also, there's a lot of animal rights movement. There's a lot of moving pieces here that I feel we have to be extremely meaningful with. And there's some real differences between urban and rural here. So Mr. Campo, would it be feasible, and Mr. Hazel, would it be feasible to extend the consultation period as Allison mentioned, and perhaps come back to the Rural Advisory Committee to provide us the opportunity to poke a little bit further and try to really get this right?
Thank you, Madam Chair, and through you, absolutely. And I'll defer to our enforcement coordinator, Mr. O'Shea, just to chime in on this as well. But I don't see this as a problem.
Yes, and thank you, Kyle, and through you, Madam Chair. We most certainly can extend the consultation period. So November right now is the time frame we have for an online survey that we'll be conducting. I know the committee members can appreciate that in the time of COVID, we can't do a lot of our traditional engagement, such as open houses or more face-to-face meetings. So we're adapting as best we can. We also are doing some direct stakeholder engagement. So we're contacting various groups such as animal welfare agencies, the Humane Society, the Frontenac Federation of Agriculture. So if the committee members have any other stakeholder groups that they feel we should contact, I would appreciate receiving that, and that can be perhaps relayed through the clerks. In addition, we can also work out a time for providing another opportunity for the committee to comment. Our end goal at this time is to bring a final report for consideration to the, it's actually the Arts, Recreation, and Community Policies Committee that has responsibility for animal control. And the goal is to bring a final report to them in late February of 2021. So we do have some time in December and January as well. Plus, we also are intending on having a, I'll call it a fact sharing open house held via Zoom in December, where we will share with the public the results of the survey and get additional feedback. So there are many more opportunities, and we can build in an additional trip to our friends at Rural Advisory Committee as well. Thank you.
That is very much appreciated. Our next meeting is December 7th. I don't know if this will line up with your activities, but otherwise we can definitely speak as to how we can make this happen, because I think it's a hot topic. It's a very important one, and it can get very emotional just because of the deep connection between the human being and their animals. So that's definitely appreciated. Is there anything to add, Charlie, Councillor Shroff, Allison?
I did have my hands up. Hearing what I've heard now, I feel some reassurance, and I will also engage in urban issues on my other committees, like housing and rental property owners, affordable housing. There's lots of issues there that are quite different than the rural area, and so. But as a rural councillor right now, I would really like to see where, perhaps in the bylaw, as I scroll through, that there would be an R or a U, some kind of differentiation within it, recognizing the significant differences that there are. I don't know if any other community does that, but we managed to do it in the trees and bylaws. So, with Greg, we really worked hard, Ryan and I and other members of this committee. So, anyways, I really want to thank you guys for listening. Sorry, Kyle and Dan. Thank you, Dan, for being here. It's we do feel like we are being listened to. That means a lot. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Charlie, I saw your hand.
Am I on now?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. My biggest concern is we were first the night we were talking about new young farmers or new farmers coming along. And we're constantly reading in all our farm magazines and information. There's people farming on 2 acres, 5 acres, new farmers, new ideas. And I just hope that's taken into account, because somebody can raise a lot of chickens on 5 acres if they do it properly. There was a real interesting article in a magazine about a month ago, people out in Vancouver Island who are raising, I think it was 3,000 layer hens and 3,000 meat hens. They've got a greenhouse, they're growing vegetables for the local restaurants, and they're feeding fly larvae from organic waste from the city of Victoria. So is all that being taken into account? It doesn't have to be just a 100-acre farm or 10-acre farm. It can be much smaller. There's a lot of people with some really neat new ideas because of the cost of startup in agriculture now is just out of touch of most people. I don't know if that's taken into account or not. That's all I have to say.
Yeah. Mr. Compo, would you like to speak to that?
Yes, thank Mr. Foreman. I think some of these answers and some of the feedback that we're looking for in terms of what you're speaking to is being sought after throughout this month. So I think we'd be in a better stance coming to the committee in December with more intuitive answers that we're getting from the public as well as our research. Again, this committee is the initial step that we've taken. So this is just the start of it for your consideration, but we're hoping to, through our research on comparisons with other municipalities, along with the feedback that we're seeking for this next month, to be able to come to those conclusions and get some, I guess, newer opinions and ideas from farmers.
Thank you. So just to close the loop, thank you very much for being here, for including us. We look forward to hearing more. Thank you for agreeing to extend the consultation. We feel this is very important. Crafting bylaws and policies like this is just as much an art as a science. I mean, taking in consideration the research, the evidence, the real correlations, as well as, you know, the individual cases of what has happened in within our communities as well, certainly is a lot of work. So thank you for consulting with us, and we look forward to having you back. So this closes the business items for tonight. There are no motions, there are no notices of motions, there are no business, there is no correspondences. The date and time of the next meeting is December 7th, 2020. And so this meeting is coming to a close. Can I have someone to move the motion to adjourn? Please. Allison, seconded by Charlie Foreman. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you.